All right, we know recruiting, team building, retention is wacky right now. Fortunately, we're going to take a look at Jobvite's 2021 Recruiter Nation report to pick up trends that you can put into practice at your own organization. Today on Culture Builder Live. Hey there, I'm Chris Wink. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Technically, the news organization that covers local tech economies and builds a community of tech professionals. So if you're following along with Technically, you know we are gasping at trying to cover wage inflation, price inflation, great resignation, team building, retention. It's a lot. It's a zoo. That's why I was quite interested when Jobvite launched its 2021 Recruiter Nation report and wanted to dig in a little bit to the numbers. To help me do that, I have Jobvite's chief data scientist, Morgan Llewellyn. Morgan, thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Christopher. Thank you.
It is a pleasure, Morgan. You're not lying. It's true. So there's a lot in the Recruiter Nation report. We'll drop the link below the video and in the Technically recap story. But let's start with a couple of themes that'll be most relevant for the Technically community of software companies and stage, some in life sciences, the like. Remote work. Probably you've heard of it. This was already really common in and among software firms. It's clearly accelerated. I wonder if you could start with inside of in the Recruiter Nation report, what seems to be most recently changing, shifting? What's becoming clearly normalized? Any trends you're seeing?
Yeah, so I think one of the trends we are seeing is, to use that word normalized, right? We are seeing remote work is being normalized, specifically among some industries such as software development, right? Where if you're not offering remote work, if you're not offering kind of hybrid models, it's a lot harder to recruit right now. That this is normal, this is what candidates are expecting. And so companies who are shying away from remote work are having a little bit harder time right now.
And I mean, we've seen early reports about how much this can range when we talk about remote work. I'm quite sure some listeners will be bored about this conversation at this point. Some have moved entirely remote. What the upper bounds, I think we're still figuring out, at least with Technically's reporting. We are finding a fair number of companies. We did a report, a survey of a few hundred tech companies that we cover, and nearly 3/4 of them were still saying they thought they would retain some office, have some in-office time. But we also saw really fast growth in the number of companies that did go fully remote. So what this balance will be, how many will be fully remote, how many will do some version of hybrid, that still seems to be shaking out. Are you seeing any sense of, do you still think it's being shook out?
Yeah, I do. And I think there's a couple of considerations to have, right? There's definitely the supply side, right, of what
Mm,
companies are willing to do. How many people are they willing to let be remote? But then there's also the demand side, right? We've been hiring remote workers for a long time now. And there's definitely a different type of person that enjoys that remote work. So you got to consider the demand side. While the supply side is determined by the companies, the demand side is ultimately going to be determined by that workers. It's something they enjoy and something they want. And that might vary based on industry. I think the other big open question that we still have and is really shown in the Recruiter Nation report is the choice to work remote, is that going to impact career trajectory? There's an open question on that. A lot of recruiters, right, about half of recruiters think that could impact kind of the career trajectory of folks, right? That there's a choice to be made there as well. So I think there's a couple of open questions, particularly around career trajectory and really how is this going to be embraced by workers in a year, 5 years, that type of thing.
Can you just say a bit more from the report on what do recruiters mean when they say it can impact career trajectory?
Yeah, so basically it's going to be one of those, can it impact management, right? Can it impact your advancement? Is it limiting in some way, shape, or form? And I think there's just an open question on that.
Mm-hmm.
I think I think for a lot of organizations that's been doing this for a long time, the answer is no. And I think companies that are new to it are still figuring it out, and there's some uncertainty there.
Yeah, I think we've spoken to a few companies with multiple offices, couple of publicly traded companies that are just seeing fewer offices but larger hubs. And this is what we already are quite familiar with, the idea of office not being a place to do work but office to drive connections. It's more an experience than it is purely getting your stuff done. Those seem clear. Okay. Remote does seem like a degree of table stakes at this
Yeah,
point for attracting competitive talent. Like, that's just whether you're either hybrid or fully remote. It seems like that's purely the option. The question of how much do you have to be for our purposes, technically we have a couple offices. We're not using them. We have a staff that I think is reticent to go back to an office. I feel unsure about what this looks like 6 to 8 months from now. Is that office entirely waste? Are we programming around it? I think that maybe we represent other companies we cover that I'm sure how this plays out.
yeah, I think you've got two different driving factors here when you talk about fully remote and hybrid remote, right? Your talent pool that you're able to hire in a hybrid environment isn't much different than if you're fully,
Right.
or sorry, if you're fully in office,
That's
right?
like a
Like
pure
you're still
benefit.
playing. Yeah, you're exactly right. It's about making that job, making that lifestyle, reducing traffic time, but you're still planting the flag somewhere and saying, okay, anyone who lives within a location, you come and, apply for a job and you can work with us. Fully remote changes the game, right? It's really about expanding that talent pool to wherever the great talent is. And so it's a benefit versus, can you expand that talent pool with the fully remote? Like that's the conversation to be had here and how to think about these two.
I want to move on here, but one lingering point that you're hitting on when you touched on the supply side, demand side, which I think is an interesting framing for this, that came to mind for me, that in a few conversations with CEOs, I found myself reminding them that when you increase the pool of potential talent, you also increase the pool of potential competitors for that talent. And somewhere there is a balance, right? Like, where a company can do that math of whether I am in the short term benefiting myself by accessing maximum global access to talent, but having these other constraints, different competitive environment for who we're competing against, and also just time zone or whatever other constraints. There are levers there that you're probably pulling and ultimately having to decide what's the right mix for us. Um, does that? I don't think I saw that necessarily in the nation in the Jobvite Recruiter Nation report, but I'm curious. Did that come up in any research you've seen about whether it's more competitive? It's not purely, oh, I turn it on and I get all the talent in the world. It's a new
Mhm.
ball game.
Yeah, I think I think really what you're addressing is, look, big organizations, and let's stick with software for instance, where
Yeah.
where remote is very feasible. Big companies are coming to, more remote locations. You're going to be competing against the Googles, right, of the world, whether you want to or not. Now the
Mm,
question is, are you willing to stay in your local market and kind of look just within your local market, or are you going to try and get outside your local market as well? Pros
mm,
and cons to both approaches, but I don't think you should be scared about, okay, what is us going into another market open us to competition? The competition's coming to you. How are you going to react to that competition? I think that's the way to frame that question for business and CEOs.
well said. All right, let's turn here. Something that's very interesting in this report. Again, we'll make sure to drop the links, you guys can get the full one, the full version of it. But um, there's some changes afoot in what comp and benefits packages are being prioritized. That is shifting a bit, and there were some threads there that I hadn't yet seen. So, talk to me a little bit about what is changing, that you're hearing from in this large report across recruiters across industries and firms.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that I found, maybe perhaps surprising in the Recruiter Nation report was just the, deprioritization on stock options, sign-on bonuses in the minds of candidates, right? That those weren't the things kind of putting someone over the edge, kind of over the edge, right, and getting the deal done. The way I look into that is in this environment of wage growth. Um, those are just table stakes, right? Everyone's got similar kind of comp packages. And if you're not bringing the comp package, you're not in the conversation. And
Mm,
so those additional benefits that I thought were really interesting and, maybe kind of viewed through the lens of COVID is, the additional emphasis and benefit that people are placing on things like, daycare or, assistance with different family planning types of events, and that was becoming more attractive. Recruiters are seeing those as more attractive to candidates. The comp, I wouldn't say comp isn't, money is always important, but I think really what we're seeing here is those are just table stakes. And if you're not bringing the financial package, you're not in the conversation. The thing that's putting someone over the edge is, just some of these additional things like, kind of prioritization of ability to prioritize family, as well as things like DE&I, right? That was also very surprising is how many candidates we're seeing just asking about, well, what are you doing from a DE&I? Kind of the package right now, it reminds me a little bit of the housing market, right? You can bring the best offer, but it's what are all the bells and whistles that you're throwing on top of that offer, right? In terms of family, in terms of, how your company thinks about diversity and inclusion. Those are what's pushing the offers over the edge.
You're pointing out something very clear in software, that as technical roles, particularly in and around engineering and product and software, if we have a very big national story right now of whether balance has tipped a bit more into in the workers' hands over capital, at least for the time being, that software seems to be at the very leading edge of that because of the enormous shortage of those skills. That's now driving the narrative, and these issues of childcare and the like. I mean, that can sound, it's just the next territory of what needs to be offered. Let me ask it like this, and this actually might be a good segue to a final point that I want to make sure to hit on. I've been interested in how many well-funded venture-backed software CEOs are telling me, man, my spreadsheets are looking a little crazy now with salaries, and people who aren't cash constrained feeling that they're meeting some upper bounds of the rate of salary growth. And that doesn't even speak to the kind of bootstrap companies we also cover that may not have the ability to just kind of go to a bigger bank account. So I'm kind of curious, are you yet seeing upper bounds of salary growth? Is there any signs here that companies can at least be in the ballpark with salary, but make it up for with additional benefits? You mentioned you got to have the comp or you're not even in the game. I wonder how close do you have to be, as I'm beginning to hear CEOs sit out some offer making for the first time I've heard in 15 years of this kind of reporting.
Yeah, so I think you raise a good question, and let me address the first one, right? So,
Yeah.
do we expect wage growth to slow? When we look at Recruiter Nation, we see over 70% of recruiters are seeing candidates, negotiating for higher salaries, right? And so candidates know basically the ball's in their court, right? And they've got an advantage here. The other interesting thing I'm seeing is when we look at the Great Resignation, right? It's typically greatest among mid-career folks. These people aren't leaving for lower salaries; they're leaving for higher salaries, and so they're at some level kind of feeding some of that wage growth. Who do you replace those folks with? Right? How do you attract people to replace those mid-career folks? Again, you're having to bring dollars to replace them. And so there's a little bit of a cycle going on right now where we've got mid-career folks leaving for, what I would expect to be higher paying jobs. And then you're having to replace them with other individuals, and you're giving those people higher salaries as well to attract them. You've got that playing out on one side. The long-term impact, it really is going to come back to inflation, is how far do those dollars go? That's at some level being dictated by inflation. If inflation keeps increasing, you're going to see demands on wage growth continue to, remain or persist, right? To pull people off of the sidelines, we've got 10 million open jobs. We have, 4 to 5 million people on the sidelines. To pull those people in, you're going to need greater dollars. And so if I don't see wage growth slowing in the very near term, longer term, I think it's going to be dependent upon what really happens on the inflation picture.
And I mean, when you're by inflation picture, of course, you mean, what does transitory inflation mean? Are we at sustained 5% year on year? inflation for a period? Does that go more? Does that shrink back? That's kind of what you're getting of like right now.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, say because whether I'm talking to companies about if they're already profitable, they're talking about how much they have to protect margin. If they're venture backed and pure growth, that's it. It's a different calculus for them. It's purely like it's an arms race. There is no, they just have to go as fast as they can. So that obviously means I'm still trying to wrap around my head of how that plays out. Someone has to, enough people have to begin to leave the bidding process to have any rate of salary growth cool. Because right now we're hearing the CEO that said someone went, was at fourth interview and was still actively interviewing with a handful of companies, and I got another $50,000 increased salary request on the final day of comp, and that CEO said I had to sit out. I pulled out of that job offer. Those sorts of stories are super new to me, particularly for the kinds of companies we typically cover that are not feeling are not penny pinching. So play that out a little bit more about what inflation can do for this equation of the next year.
Yeah, so there's two things going on here, right? On the inflation side, if you're paying 20% more for housing, 20% more for daycare, 20% more for food, right? A candidate coming into the market is going to be looking at it and saying, look, in order to have a quality of life, right? I'm going to require this salary, which is going to be X more than it was, say, 12 months ago. I'm just throwing 20% numbers out there, right? That's
Sure.
Yeah.
Don't make us all nervous, Morgan.
Yeah.
It's Morgan. I mean, Jay Powell's going to call you. Come on.
Yeah. So there's that, but I think what you're talking about is if you want to see wage growth, it comes back to supply and demand of labor, right? We've got 10 million jobs out there. We've got 4 to 5 million people, estimated that are kind of have been removed from from search right now. It's about supply and demand. If you want to see less growth in wages, you got to have fewer bidders for that candidate. And so, to your point, if you start seeing CEOs sitting out the market, right, and saying, I think I can get by with what I have, that could put some dampening pressure on wage growth. But you need fewer bidders for the limited supply that's out there right now. If you want to see that wage growth cool.
And clearly the point is many of the headline numbers that we're seeing, we've seen some modest wage growth overall. That's across a very wide and diverse economy. And in software, we've sometimes struggled to see some of this showing up in the data because it is it's a narrow niche, and those roles are among the most coveted. Morgan, thank you so much. We got a jet. So Morgan Llewellyn, Chief Data Scientist at Jobvite. Again, we'll drop links to the Jobvite's 2021 Recruiter Nation report. Morgan, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure indeed. All right, that's this week's Culture Builder Live. We'll catch you next week. See ya.